Hey everyone, today I want to make the case as to why you should not live your best life using the ideas of Jacques Lacan, Slavoj Žižek, sprinkled in with a bit of the theology of Peter Rollins. Now, firstly, of course, let's try and understand what the thesis I'm trying to negate here is. What do I mean by living your best life? I think the best way to make sense of this, let's call it societal, cultural imposition, is to go through podcasts that people consume and the books people read. So if you look at contemporary culture, and if you look at, let's say, it's kind of consumerist, productivist, moral injunctions, if you look at, let's say, the Amazon bestseller list, which I have opened right here, I just Googled it for this video, you'll see some of the best-selling books are in the self-help category. Books like Atomic Habits or Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And yes, there's some pop fiction, but there certainly are many books that are either in the personal finance or the self-help category, along with the new age self-actualization category books like Eckhart Tolle, people like that. And if you look at the top podcasts like Andrew Huberman's the Huberman Lab podcast, which is a pretty good podcast on health and well-being, but people certainly obsess over the tips that Andrew Huberman gives on how to optimize your life, how to optimize your brain or your physiology and whatnot. And then, of course, another example, which probably is a bit more from even before my time, really, is the book The Secret by what's her name, the Australian Rhonda Byrne, right? So this book, just according to Wikipedia, it's sold over 30 million copies worldwide. That's a lot of copies. That certainly is a bestseller. There was a documentary about this book. People still talk about things like the law of attraction and this kind of, I call it toxic positivity, where it seems like in our culture, the imposition, kind of the imposition by God himself in many ways, is to live your best life, to self-actualize, to be as productive as you can be, to be as healthy as you can be, and not only that, to also, in the more of the consumerist, crass, crude sense, to have as much as you want to have. Not merely in the sense of just, let's say, material things like clothes and shoes and cars and watches or whatnot, but even experiences, travel, experience the world. And of course, we have, colloquial terms like FOMO, the fear of missing out and whatnot. And all of this comes from this deep-seated imposition that we put onto ourselves, ironically, or rather farcically, I'd say, to live your best life. And the question is, what does that mean? Why do we always feel guilty for not living our best life? Why do we always feel guilty for missing out? Not just on things that are purely entertaining, but even on things like self-actualization and becoming divine in some sense and becoming whole, or to use a more technical term, why do we always have this desire for ontological wholeness? One way to answer that question is through the ideas of Peter Rollins, who says that we are subjects of the achievement society. Our culture is a culture of self-help and achievement. We have to live our best lives. The imperative by God himself, even though most people in modernity are so-called atheists, is to self-actualize, to live your best life. And unlike in the past, the categorical imperative, to use a Kantian term, or simply what we ought to do, what we should do, was, don't lie, don't cheat, don't murder, don't commit adultery, all the, typical traditional Christian virtues, let's say. The categorical imperative of our times, the demands of our times, is to achieve. And that's why Peter Rollins says we are subjects. We are people living in achievement society or achievement culture, because that is ultimately what we're supposed to do, achieve. And if you could take those ideas of achievement or living your best life, which seem a bit more metaphysical, and let's say try and make them a bit more psychoanalytical, the best way to put it is in now Slavoj Žižek's catchphrase, which is, enjoy a superego.
The traditional notion of psychoanalysis is that because of some inner obstacles you internalized, identified excessively with paternal or other social prohibitions, you cannot set yourself free to enjoy, to pleasure is not accessible for you. It is accessible to you only in pathological forms of feeling guilty and so on. So then the idea is psychoanalysis allows you to suspend, overcome these internalized prohibitions so that it enables you to enjoy. The problem today is that the commandment of the ruling ideology is enjoy in different ways. It can be sexual enjoyment, consumption, commodity enjoyment, up to spiritual enjoyment, realize yourself, whatever. And I think that the problem today is not how to get rid of your inhibitions and to be able to spontaneously enjoy. The problem is how to get rid of this injunction to enjoy.
Now, before I get to the negation, to keep fleshing this idea out, I'm going to use two books by Slavoj Žižek. The first one is perhaps one of his most accessible books, How to Read Lacan, and the second one is certainly one of his hardest books to read, for they know not what they do. Here's what he says about superego or enjoy superego in How to Read Lacan, and after I read from both these books, I'll kind of explain what he means here. Žižek states, superego is real, the cruel and insatiable agency that bombards me with the impossible demands and then mocks my botched attempts to meet them. The agency in whose eyes I am all the more guilty, the more I try to suppress my sinful strivings and meet its demands. The cynical old Stalinist motto about the accused at show trials who profess their innocence, the more innocent they are, the more they deserve to be shot, is superego at its purest. For Lacan, superego has nothing to do with moral conscience as far as its most obligatory demands are concerned. Superego is, on the contrary, the anti-ethical agency, the stigmatization of our ethical betrayal. So that excerpt I read is a very, I call it summarized or culled down version of a very perspicacious idea that Zizek has been writing about ever since he's been writing, really. The idea that the Lacanian superego, at least in modernity, in our culture, is quite different to what we would, let's say, conventionally think about the Freudian superego, where generally, if you ask from any person who has any idea of who Freud is, and you bring up the concept of the superego, let's say the superego is this ethical agency, kind of like, the Kantian categorical imperative that talks about, don't lie, don't cheat, be a good person, carry out your civic duties, whatnot. Although our culture, things have shifted. Our superego is the imperative, as I said it many times already, to in fact be anti-ethical. In fact, to, not in a hedonistic sense, to an indulge, but rather the demand itself is to live your best life, as I said in this video. And ironically, a part of living your best life is certainly being anti-ethical and doing things that are moral transgressions, so to speak. But also, again, the new age stuff, self-actualization and whatnot. But then comes the important point where he makes the cynical Stalinist joke that the reality of the superego demands are that they can never be met. And in fact, the more we carry them out, the guiltier we feel. The more we engage in self-help, the more we engage in productivity, reading all these books and listening to all these podcasts, all the other side of things, the more consumerist we become, the more we try to experience new things and constantly pursue novelty, the less emptier and more guiltier we feel, in the sense that we always feel we aren't doing enough. And that's the cruel, sadistic nature of the superego. So that idea of the superego demands being unfulfillable brings us to an excerpt from this book, For They Know What They Do, where initially, before I read the excerpt, Žižek states that, as we probably all kind of intuit, at least, we all kind of feel it, that in postmodern culture, we have no moral laws, per se. We have no substructure that guides us in how traditional societies did guide us, in the sense that most people are atheistic, we have no metaphysical principles, and we don't have a lot of prohibitions. Now, of course, the naive way to view that is we think, oh, that means we can live in infinite bliss and freedom. There isn't all these old patriarchal ways of existence. We could just be free. It's not so simple. Here's what Žižek states. He states, how do we account for this paradox that the absence of law universalizes prohibition? There's only one possible explanation. Enjoyment itself, which we experience as transgression, is in its innermost status something imposed, ordered when we enjoy. We never do it spontaneously. We always follow a certain injunction. The psychoanalytical name for this obscene injunction, for this obscene call, enjoy your superego. So here's where all the ideas connect. In the past, the universal law, the Kantian categorical imperative, was prohibition. Do not do this. Whereas now, in our postmodern culture, it is you ought to do this, you must do this, you should do this. You must read this many self-help books. You must listen to all these productivity podcasts. You must take care of your health. You must focus solely on your well-being and on your health. You must have this much money. You must own this thing. You must have this experience, so on and so on. You get the point. And of course, that begs the question, if the current imperative, and we can't detach ourselves from these imperatives, they're there regardless of whether we like them or not. How do we live our best life? Unfortunately, here's where things get a bit dark. It's impossible. It's primarily due to two reasons. Because firstly, we don't really want to live our best life. What we want to do is to fantasize about living our best life, but never really live it.
You have a serious ideological deviation at the very beginning of famous proclamation of independence, pursuit of happiness. If there is a point in psychoanalysis, it is that people do not really want or desire happiness. And I think it's good that it is like that. For example, let's be serious. When you are in a creative endeavor, in that wonderful fever, my God, I'm onto something, and so on, happiness doesn't enter it. You are ready to suffer. Sometimes scientists, I read history of quantum physics or earlier of radiation, were even ready to take into account the possibility that they will die because of some radiation and so on. Happiness is for me an unethical category. And also, we don't really want to get what we think that we want. The classical story that I like, the traditional male chauvinist scenario. I am married to a wife, relations with her are cold, and I have a mistress. And all the time I dream, oh my God, if my wife were to disappear, I'm not a murderer, but let us say, drop me, it would open up new life for me with the mistress. You know what every psychoanalyst will tell you quite often happens? That then, for some reason, wife goes away, you lose the mistress also. You thought, this is all I want. When you have it there, you turn out that it was a much more complex situation where what you want is not really to live with the mistress, but to keep her as a distance, as an object of desire about which you dream. And this is not just an excessive situation. I claim that this is how things function. We don't really want what we think we desire.
It of course manifests in consumerism, as we all know. The more we shop, the more we buy things and purchase things, the more we want to shop and buy and purchase things. What we are really looking for is, in that case, not a particular consumable item, or not a particular commodity, but rather at a fundamental ontological level, what we desire is the objet art, this virtual void that isn't there. But perhaps even more pertinently to our times, leaving consumerism aside because it seems rather obvious, it is also the fact that we never do really want our desire to be ever met. Despite the fact that it's unfulfillable, regardless, what we want to do is fantasize about this objet art, about getting whatever this virtual category is, this empty virtual category is. And perhaps the quintessential example is something like Paris syndrome, where, as we all know, it's a phenomena where many people, many tourists, whoever, they always fantasize about Paris. And once they do go to Paris, once they do go to France, they see that it's just the brutal reality of what it is, and they see that, oh, it's just another stupid country. Of course, what they really were fantasizing about wasn't Paris, the actual material place, rather the objet art. And I think Žižek puts it best, where he says that if there's anything psychoanalysis has told us, it is that human beings fundamentally don't want to be happy or don't want their desires to be met. So to keep expanding on this idea a bit more theoretically, Todd McGovern elucidates it really well in his book, Capitalism and Desire. He states, capitalism is the effect of sustaining subjects in a constant state of desire. As subjects of capitalism, we are constantly on the edge of having our desire realized, but never reach the point of realization. This has the effect of producing a satisfaction that we don't recognize as such. That is, capitalist subjects experience satisfaction itself as dissatisfying, which enables them to simultaneously enjoy themselves and believe wholeheartedly that a more complete satisfaction exists just around the corner, embodied in the newest commodity. So, of course, when McGovern talks about capitalism, he's also talking about the capitalist ideology, which is the kind of the culture that I'm talking about of living your best life. And I'm sorry to quote myself here, but a little commentary on what Todd McGovern wrote. Here's what I wrote, and again, I'm sorry for narcissistically quoting myself. Since our lack is unfulfillable and our desire is unmeetable, we are the perfect subjects for capitalist dynamics because paradoxically, capitalism works by not working. We are always kept on the edge of having our desires met by, in fact, not having them ever met in reality. So you could replace the word capitalism with New Age, with self-help, and the idea would still apply. And then we come to the other concept, which is perhaps one of Lacan's deepest ideas, where he famously said, desire full stop is always the desire of the other, which basically means that we are always asking the other what he desires. And this is where Žižek states in his book, but even in the video I just showed you, that our desires, what we are supposed to do, living your best life, whatever it may be, don't come in any authentic, spontaneous sense. It always comes by the other, which is our socio-symbolic reality of culture, of society, and it manifests in many ways. It's through, of course, the very conspicuous marketing, celebrity culture, whatnot, but even in more subtle ways where it could be completely unconscious. Nonetheless, our desires are always coming to us from society. Okay, so it seems like using these Lacanian ideas of psychoanalysis and Žižek's ideas of more cultural analysis, we seem to be in quite a dilemma, given the fact that, firstly, our superego demands of living your best life can never be met, and the more you try, the guiltier you will feel. And secondly, the fact that you realize that your desire is not some authentic desire of you wanting to live your best life is never what you truly want, but rather it's what society is telling you to want. We seem to be stuck in a rather catch-22. What do we do? What's the solution here? Now, the purpose of this video, like all my videos, is never to give any easy solutions, nor is it to ever, absolutely not give advice, because what the hell do I know? But at least to end the video on a high note and not in a kind of cynical, defeatist note, I could talk about a few things that Peter Rollins introduces to this conversation. He too was, in fact, influenced heavily by Lacan and Žižek, but his kind of theological understanding of what we can do, given that we, in many ways, need to try and liberate ourselves from this culture of self-help and productivity and living your best life. But before talking about certain things we could do living amidst such a culture and such a social reality, there's a caveat, a very important caveat that I need to put forward, which is you cannot step outside of ideology. Now, I've spoken about ideology quite a lot in this video, and especially postmodern capitalist ideology. Now, we could all think the way the Andrew Tate people think. That means now that I know all these things, I could just step outside of ideology and get red-pilled. And wake up to the truth. This is, to quote Lacan himself, "Les non dupes errent," which means those who are not duped err most. To think that you can step out of ideology is the most ideological thing you could do. So whenever someone tells you, here's the reality of our world, here's consumerism, here's all the problems we're facing, come to me, I'll give you the solution, that is instantly ideology suspect. Because the solution itself is a ideological reality. Because we can never step outside of ideology. This is perhaps one of Zizek's most original and perspicacious points, that the only way to live in such a reality is to understand that ideology itself is our socio-symbolic reality that gives meaning to our lives. So the only way to live in such a reality is to critique ideology from within. Not to think that you can step outside of ideology and to make this argument a bit more metaphysical in the very famous Plato's cave example. The idea is not that you could step outside of the cave and then see reality. Rather, reality itself presents itself to you through the cave. And the way you understand reality is through critique of ideology, in this case, critique of our social reality. So with that caveat out of the way, here's one thing Peter Rollins suggests. It is the idea of grace. It's a very Christian concept, of course. And in such a culture of self-help, such a culture of obsession with living your best life, one thing we can struggle to do is, in fact, understand how grace works. Grace is a unearned love. And now you might think that, oh, unearned love, it's great. God's grace, it's fantastic. But no, it's not just saying there's some abstract God out there loving me, but rather learning in your social reality that you have the ability, the space, the freedom, whatever you may call it, to accept love. To accept love from your friends, from your family, and if you believe in God, from God himself, that it's okay to not fall into achievement society and just simply, and to use a very, very cliched term, be the stupid, dumb self you are and still find love in this world. Find love in however way it may manifest. And this is in fact what the radical notion of grace is, because grace, Christian grace particularly, is unearned love. And you might think, oh, again, as I said before, that it's fine, I can enjoy unearned love, but no. Keep in mind that in our postmodern society, with all the superego imperatives of achieving, of doing the best, of getting to the top, of being your best self, receiving anything unearned is a traumatic, even traumatic experience. It is something we struggle a lot to feel loved in this world and to accept love. But if we learn, and that's really important, if we learn how to accept love and to accept grace, I believe to a certain extent this can help us to live within such a ideological society with our current moral impositions and superego imperatives. And the second thing is, as much as we learn to receive love, we also learn to give love and to love others. Now, there are two ways I would put this. I could say, oh, of course, it comes in interpersonal relations, romantic love, loving your friends, loving your family. But I also think, and perhaps this is quite important, given as Aristotle said, we are political animals, and he meant that more in the sense of we are social animals in a social reality, not in this day-to-day silly, the spectacle of politics. He didn't mean that at all. Given that we are a part of society, as much as society is out there, it's also within us. It's learning to understand that it's important to have a vocation. It's important to have an existential project in life, whatever it may be. You could be a writer, you could be a political activist, you could be a scientist, an engineer, an entrepreneur, whatever it may be. It has to be something that's an existential project, not something silly like careerism or making money, not playing the rat race and falling into the game of capitalism, certainly not, but rather understanding that what you do in this world matters not only to yourself but also to others. And I think that in some sense liberates us from this kind of narcissistic obsession to live your best life and to always self-actualize. So yeah, that's at least for me what's helped me to understand that I don't have to live my best life. I could be the shitty, stupid person I am, but at the same time learn to love, learn to accept love, but also to find a vocation and to commit myself to that cause, to that vocation, and in fact to go all the way. Not to live this kind of tepid life of, oh, I've got to meditate 5 hours a day, have my cold shower, exercise, take all my vitamins, and live this perfect, balanced, holistic life. None of that. To understand that existence itself has a antagonism and chaos to it, and that despite that chaos, or perhaps through it, I will learn to partake in my vocation, partake in my existential project, while also understanding that the ultimate guiding principle, the impetus behind all of it is love. And that is why I would say Christian theology, the Christian idea of grace, certainly, I would say, is perhaps most important for our culture than any other culture. When I mean our culture, I mean neoliberal capitalist culture in the times we live in.